Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Huber. I'm joined by John Doyle today and special guest Vic Tesolin, all the way from Canada.
All the way.
So, hope you enjoy today's show as we talk about Vic, his new book, Working in Small Shops, and what it means to be a minimalist woodworker. So, let's get started.
This episode of the ShopNotes Podcast is brought to you by Woodsmith Magazine. Woodsmith Magazine has been the trusted source for all your woodworking information for over 40 years. From tips and techniques to furniture projects to shop projects, you'll find it all at Woodsmith Magazine. Subscribe today at woodsmith.com.
All right, Vic, we're going to assume the same thing that most people assume about Woodsmith is that they've never really heard of us.
Okay.
And if nobody's ever heard of you, what would they need to know?
Turn the other way and run. So after a 14-year career in the Canadian military, I left early because I had injured my shoulder. Nothing of any sort of valor. I used to play rugby for the Army, and I got beat up pretty bad in the game. So. But anyhow, I attended Rosewood Studio in Ontario, Canada, where I did the sort of full, furniture design and making course, and then, have done a few things since then. I was the editor of Canadian Woodworking magazine for just over a year, and then ended up going to work for Veritas, mainly in the R&D department. Working with an incredible group of designers and engineers that produce the Veritas line, and so recently have struck out on my own, and am doing a lot of online teaching and that sort of thing. Of course, with COVID, it's everything's much easier online. But I've also written quite a few articles for various magazines around the world, and then I've also written a book called The Minimalist Woodworker, and there's a follow-up coming up, projects from the Minimalist Woodworker.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of where I want to take this to begin, is where you came up with your own journey as a minimalist woodworker, because I followed you online for quite a while now, and it's definitely evolved, right?
Oh, for sure. A lot of people make the assumption that I am a minimalist woodworker, and the reality is that I do use machines, and when I have had various size shops over the years, I've just kind of been very selective about what I use and what I don't use, and because the thought of not woodworking just simply because you don't have the space is ridiculous.
Right.
So really, the book concept came along. Because I just got tired of people saying, oh, well, I can't run a table saw, so I can't be a woodworker, or, I can't run a router because I have like a kid asleep above me in the room above the garage, and so I can't make noise. And so I just, I realized that, there's a lot of people who are not enjoying woodworking because they're under this sort of idea that they need X tool or Y tool in order to be able to do it. So I just wanted to bring it all right back and say, okay, listen, you don't need any of that stuff. Crazy, you can work just with hand tools if you want. And I come at it from a pretty pragmatic sort of point of view. I am not I don't know what you would call them, hand tool aficionado, or
monks.
I don't wear woolen underwear. I don't work by candlelight, that sort of thing. So for me, it's okay, well, what's practical? What makes sense? If you can't have a table saw, does that mean that you can't woodwork? Well, no, it just means that you have to break down your lumber in other ways. And so I wanted to introduce those skills to people. Now, again, I can flatten boards by hand. I can process them by hand, get them thickness by hand, the whole 9 yards. But I don't find that if I have the space and I have the power and the ability to make noise and dust collection and all that other stuff, I'm not going to just do it by hand for the sake of doing it by hand, right? So,
right.
A lot of my students and people who read the book, they start out with just hand tools, But then they say, listen, I think I got room for like one power tool, like what should I get? And so I always recommend the bandsaw because it's such a versatile tool.
Right.
And man, can that save you some time, like just think about resawing a board in half, like holy cow. It's a long, I've done it by hand and in a couple of different methods. And I mean, it's a long, sweaty process. And so being able to, add a machine here or a machine there, or like a drill press, like a lot of times a drill press, it's not loud. It doesn't belch out dust everywhere. So a lot of times, a drill press can be added to the shop. So, I'm pragmatic about it. I don't, do it for the sake of doing it. Use the tools that make sense in your shop. And if you can't have anything that plugs in, that's fine. You can still woodwork.
Yep. Yeah, I find that's a really good philosophy for woodworkers that are just starting out to kind of get started with hand tools, decide what you want to do, and then you're like, hey, I'm doing a lot of, ripping boards or, so then it's like, oh, well, maybe I can invest in this power tool and fit that in my shop and move up from there rather than I'm going to buy all the expensive tools and I'm going to start woodworking and, find out you don't like it or you're doing something differently than you thought. And
Right.
And then
right.
you have
And
all
I mean,
these tools
people do
need.
it all the time, and I did it myself. I mean, like I bought stuff that I thought I needed and didn't really. The classic example was I bought this like little job site table saw because I needed a table saw, but I was working in a one-car garage, and so I didn't have really the room for one. But so I ended up getting this job site saw, which wasn't, it wasn't a bad tool, but at the same time, it's like I didn't need it. Right? There was other ways to do things.
Right.
And then of course, everybody's table saw kind of turns into a bit of a crap stacker. So you end up like taking a bunch of stuff off of it to use it, and then but then you put it all onto your bench, and then you got to put it back onto the table saw when you're done, and it just. So anyway, it's one of those things where it's like, I opted to go instead with a track saw, and it really reduced the amount of space that I needed. And even to this day, now that I have a table saw that was given to me for free, I didn't buy it. A friend of mine upgraded his saw to one of the saw stops. And so he just gave me his old saw, which is kind of nice of him. But at the same time, I find myself laying a piece of styrofoam down on the top of it all the time and cutting with my track saw, which the irony's not lost on me, but it's pretty funny how that works out. But.
It's a cast iron workbench that just happens to have a saw blade in it.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that in the fact that when we bought our first house and I was working here, I'm like, I'm a woodworker, so I need a table saw, right? But I didn't have a ton of money, so you just go out and buy the $99 benchtop saw, And yeah, it does work. Is it ideal? No, but you can make do with it. But I think it's kind of interesting, and I live in this world a little bit that woodworking tends to be or feel prescriptive on stuff where, you can't build this project because the illustrations or the photos show, some guy with whatever tool. And so it's like, well, I can't do it unless I have that tool. And there's a lot more to woodworking than that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like, I mean, I have a Panta router, but I mean, I don't usually teach my students anything about it because it's like, unless you have one, there's no point in talking about it. I mean, if you have a drill press and that's what you can do your mortises on, then that's what we work with. And that's the interesting thing about this whole teaching thing during COVID, because it allows me to see what the students have in their shop.
Sure.
Right. And so if all you have is a drill press, right, like, and you don't want to use routers or you don't own any routers, well, then that's how you're doing your mortises. Right. It's pretty simple. And so, and even when I used to teach privately before the pandemic, I would always try to do the lesson in the student shop, because then, you know what they have. If they have, a pretty simple table saw that doesn't have a great fence, well, then you're not going to show them, how to build a tenoning jig that goes over this, crummy aluminum fence, because that's not a safe thing to do, right? Yeah. But so, yeah, I think it's just, there's 100 ways to do pretty much everything in woodworking. Not a single one of them can be termed as the right one, but, it makes it it makes it nice to be able to see what other people have and what they're working with.
Sure. So let's talk about your new book that you have coming out. It's Projects from Minimalist Woodworker.
Yeah.
How does it relate to your first one?
Well, it basically is a continuation. So the first book was designed to get you set up. So, projects like a saw bench and shooting boards and mallet and, that kind of thing. So basically just to kind of get you sort of kitted out. There was a workbench, of course, and then a little shelf that allowed you to put your sort of fledgling kit of tools up there.
Sure.
And then, so the book kind of picks up from there. It's like, okay, so you've got a workbench now, you've got somewhere to process lumber, you've got a place to cut joinery and all that sort of thing. So now let's do a little bit of stuff. So, so every project in the book is basically has a duality to it in that if it turns out well, you can bring it into the house and use it as its intended purpose. If it goes pear-shaped, which oftentimes they do when you're learning, it can get repurposed as a shop tool. So, for example, one of the projects is a album crate. Up here in Canada, you used to be able to use milk crates to store your vinyl in, but now the milk companies have gotten wise to this, and they've changed the dimensions just slightly of the milk crates so that albums don't actually fit in them anymore.
What in the world?
I know. So it's very disappointing when you manage to steal a few or procure a few.
Procure, yeah.
Yeah, skillfully acquire. And then they don't fit. So I thought, well, here's a good opportunity to try, making. So I basically, the project is a set of stackable wooden crates that they nest one on top of each other with albums in them, and then you can make as many as you want.
Sure.
And they have dovetails in them, and you know what I mean? So there's a lot of learning opportunity. But if it turns out like garbage, like if you get really gappy dovetails or you're really not happy with them, then put it in the shop and throw offcuts in it, or, throw a router in it and, kind of store it that way. So everything has that sort of duality to it, so that if it goes well, great. If it doesn't, no problem. Because I think a lot of woodworkers, and you probably see this as well, it's like they get sort of paralyzed by the need for it to be good, right? Like, oh, I'm building this for my wife, or I'm building this for my mother-in-law, or I'm building this for, whomever. And there's all of this stress attached to it. And if I can teach people in a stress-free environment where it doesn't really matter if it turns out well or not, then that part is removed from them, and then they can focus more. They're not as worried about it. If something doesn't go well, it's no problem. You can just use it in the shop, and then the next one you build, you've learned your lessons from it, hopefully. If you don't learn your lessons from it, then maybe it's time to look at another, hobby, some needle cross stitching or something. But it's just one of those things that I think when you remove that anxiety and that fear from people, and you're just building for the sake of building, people tend to chill out a little bit and then be cool with it.
Yeah. I know some of the classes that I've taught, it's, the project almost is more the distraction or the vehicle for a skill acquisition or refinement.
Exactly. I used to teach young people how to build skateboards.
Oh, yeah.
And so we would run these webinars or seminars, and a mom or a dad or a grandfather or whomever would accompany the child, right? And so the child's getting a skateboard, which they're pretty stoked about, and then but the parent or the guardian is learning how to do bent laminations, right? So like a skateboard is just a fantastic project to teach somebody how to do bent lamination work. And I use a lot of bent lamination in my own work because I like curves in my work. And for me, like I don't have a real great source of air dried lumber. So for me, steam bending is difficult.
Right.
And I've always had really good results with bent lamination. So, basically you learn to work with a form, you learn to work with an inexpensive vacuum press. And you learn how to take thin pieces of wood, mold them, and turn them into something, shapely and structural. And all of a sudden you can take that skill and bring it into your shop now. And you can try your hand at making your own like decorative poles or, things like that.
Oh, yeah. No, that's pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So now one of the things you have done recently is moved into a new shop. And one thing I've kind of always found is that there's a little bit of a circular process in that we shape our shops and then they kind of shape us a little bit.
Yeah.
So, and I know you've had quite a few shops, woodworking shops, as you've gone along. So how have they shaped you in making this new one?
Well, it's interesting because like every time you work in a different space, you kind of see aspects of that space that you either like or don't like, or maybe covet for your own shop. And so it's actually almost a bit of a hindrance in a sense, because I've traveled all over the world and seen all kinds of interesting shops. Whether they were huge, multi-thousand square foot situations, all the way to the smallest one I saw was an apartment in Sweden where the master bedroom was basically, the only reason you knew it was a master bedroom is because there was a bed in the corner. But everything else was hand tool woodworking, So obviously single. But and instead of a toaster in the kitchen, there was a Tormek, so it was a really cool space. And I mean, it was probably under 300 square feet total.
Oh, wow.
So, so you see all of these interesting ways that people and different workflows and stuff like that. So for me, I started off, my first shop was 40 square feet. It was under the stairs in the basement. I had room for a workbench and some tools on the wall and on the floor, and that's about it. So then, I went to a one-car garage and then built a house that had like a purpose-built shop, and then, which I kind of designed and worked with. And then, things in life change, and so I ended up moving again. And now, this shop is about, maybe 350 square feet, so it's not massive by any stretch.
Right.
But it's the first time I have a brick building that is separate of the house.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it is completely independent. It has its own 100 amp service, and it is basically, all encompassing. It's not part of the house, which is kind of cool. And of course, that brings its own challenges. It didn't have 100 amps out there, right? So,
yeah.
That gets exciting, watching guys drag, this cable this thick through, this massive trench that they had to dig and put it all up. But I was able to have everything, all my 220 stuff and everything in there, no problem. I've got tons and tons of power. But it's interesting. It's like I'm in there now, and it's been about 6 months or so that I've sort of had everything kind of positioned, and I did things in a little different way where I kind of created this little hub in the center, which has like my dust collector, bandsaw, joiner planer combo machine, and table saw, and they're all kind of grouped in the center instead of like pushed out. Typically table saw is right dead center, and then everything else seems to be pushed out to the periphery.
Right.
But what this allowed me to do was, my thought was, well, I could probably keep all of the runs for the dust collection down to 10 feet, right? And so, so basically all I have is a 10 feet flex hose going from the machine right to the dust collector. I mean, I've never had dust collection like this before. When you can feel it pulling through the gap in the jointer, it's like, oh yeah, we got some serious dust collection going on here. But yeah, it just allowed me to try different things. And I always do like a kind of a mock-up, like I'll do a 2D drawing, and then I have like my little cutouts for all my little machines, and I can move them around and try them in different positions. And so it's one of these things where it's like, this is the first shop I've had where I feel like I can be really productive in. a lot of the shops I had, and again, like I was at a different part of my life as well. I had a full-time job. I didn't have to worry about, producing in order to make money. I was doing it more as a side hustle, and I didn't really have to worry about it. But, now I've got sort of the eye of like, okay, I got to be like organized, and everything has to be working properly, and all those other things. And I don't know that that's something that is just because I'm a professional. I think most hobbyists could really benefit from that mind frame, because when you got an hour to be in the shop, you don't want to be messing around looking for stuff and trying to figure out where you left off, and I haven't hooked up that part of the dust collection yet, and so I feel like a lot of times I've sort of hit the ground running and then just go with it, whereas with this shop I'm like purposefully slowing down so that I can like, okay, how do I address this? How do I address this? Do I need that? Is that, worth it? And I'm very relentless when it comes to assessing what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there. And I largely determine that by the amount of dust on it. If it's got a good layer of dust on it, that probably means it's not getting used all that much, and I have to do some thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So
the patina doctrine.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's if it's something like, so for example, I used to have a lot more hand tools than I do now.
Sure.
But now it's like, okay, well, I have other ways of doing that. So I kept some of them for purposes of teaching and stuff like that, to be able to, because there's not really any way to talk somebody through setting up a rabbit plane. You kind of have to
have one there.
Have one there to show them. But for the most part, like, I have sort of my main sort of hand tools that kind of surround me, and then I have what would be referred to nowadays as an anarchist tool chest, but it's actually a chest that was built in the 1800s that I inherited through somebody.
Cool.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I didn't have to build one myself too, which is great, because I wasn't sure if I'd enjoy working out of a chest. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't. I've learned. Because I did put everything in there and put it beside my workbench, and then worked like that for about a year, and I was like, no, I don't like this.
No. Yeah. No. I like drawers.
Yeah. Well, drawers are cool, except for the fact you can't see in them.
Sure.
And like in my brain, if I can't see what's in it, it's gone. Right? It's kind of like the conversation you guys were having the other day about kitchens, and it's like that area in the way back in the kitchen cabinets where things go to die. Yeah. That's, for me, like, I have like anything that has a drawer or a door, there's like one of those like labels on it that says what's in it. Because if I don't know what's in there, and I never will.
Yeah.
So
that's usually how I am with drawers too. I'm like pulling out, looking at, like going all the way down all the drawers, looking in each one, and
but it's
always in the last one,
or in a completely other unit. Like, so,
yeah.
Yeah. So for me, it's I like being organized that way, but at the same time, I need to see what's in it. So a lot of my tools that I use, like my bench planes, my chisels, my marking, measuring, all that other stuff is out in the open, and so I just have to look and grab. Right, I don't have to think about where it is or whatever. But everything else now lives in that tool cabinet, which is good because you can close it. It's got a nice, reliable dust seal on it, and so the tools that I use infrequently, or like my shoulder plane, right? Sometimes you need to tune up a joint, and you're not cutting joinery by hand. You don't need it out all the time.
All the time, yeah.
So it's just a matter of sort of streamlining things, and then getting. I feel like I've got a good flow in there now, which is good. I'm not fighting anything. I'm working with a student right now who every time he goes to do something, he's like swearing because he can't find it, or it's not set up right, or it's only partially set up, or whatever. So I said, listen, we're not going to build another thing until you sort this shop out, because you're stressing me out.
Now, do you think that's something that's carried over from your first under the stairs kind of shop, of kind of being really deliberate in tool choices, or, I mean, even technique is kind of determined by space and tools and mindset on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think, with that small space, I mean, you had to be really critical. at a time in my career when I didn't know enough to know. Right. So you think you need something, but you don't really. And then, 10 years later, you look at that tool and you go, wow, why did I buy that? So you get that kind of buyer's remorse a decade later. But yeah, I feel like that initial sort of start really kind of set the pace for the rest of it, where it's like I'm always very careful about what I put and what I don't put. And the military was like that too. I mean, it was very I was in the combat arms, I was in the artillery, and of course there's a lot of equipment, a lot of gear, and so that gear needed to be maintained properly. It needed to be put away in a serviceable condition, right, which was the rule, which is why I have a hard time putting a dull chisel away. Right, because
it hurts you a little bit.
Yeah, because I know I'm going to need it the next day. I'm going to come out, I'm going to grab it, and it's going to be dull, and I'm going to have to go and tune it up. So, I try to put my tools away sharp. I try to put them away clean. Every time I take a plane iron out of a plane to sharpen it, I take that time to wipe down the inside, maintain it, put a little bit of oil in there, make sure that it's always good to go. Because if you let your tools go to crap, then
then don't be surprised that they don't work well.
Well, that's just it. And a lot of people say, "Oh, well, this tool rusted," and all that other stuff. Well, they really only rust if you let them. It's been my experience. Unless you live in an oceanside shack with no doors on the shop, it can be a little bit difficult. But so I think all of that, all of my life experience, kind of helps me, maintain this sort of organized and sort of streamlined situation. I just and as I replace tools, I get rid of other tools. You know what I mean? I recently invested in the small Festool trim router. Because I do a lot of veneering and stuff, and so I do a lot of solid edge banding, and it has that horizontal base that allows you to just flush cut you don't have to do a single thing after it, and so I started using it, and then I have 3 other compact routers like that, so I'm getting rid of all of them because it's I don't need them, and I don't have a shop where I don't want to be that guy that has 17 routers with a different bit in each one. You know what I mean? It's I need the 3/4 inch straight bit router.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I don't mind changing the bits.
Yeah.
No, and it doesn't take that long anymore now either. It's not like it's.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I mean, depending on the system you have, a lot of them don't even have a second wrench anymore. So it just. So I try to keep things nice and clean, nice and streamlined, and not have a whole bunch of stuff. I even looked at my router bits the other day and was appalled. Over the years, it's why did I buy that?
Yeah.
So those are all going on Craigslist, and even if I get $5 for it, I'm it's better than just chucking it.
Yeah. Well, and you've passed it along to somebody else, and
right.
Hopefully they can get some use out of it. And
absolutely.
And I think that's something we've discussed, John, in previous podcasts, is the idea of, it's really easy to find that buyer's remorse or to feel regret about something. But in the process, you've learned something either about the type of work that you want to do or the approach you want to take to doing something. So, you've lost some money on it, but in the grand scheme of things, I think you probably come out ahead of it.
Right. And you always feel good when you gain that space back after you move it on to somebody else that's going to use it. And look at all the space I have. Now I can get something else.
Yeah, that's what it always boils down to, isn't it? It's you either need to sell something to get the money out of it or to get the space out of it in order to get the next thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, the other remorse that you have too is that, a lot of times you try to get away with buying something maybe less expensive or, which usually ends up being less quality. A lot of times, and my dad always taught me, he said, when you buy a good tool, you only cry once. But when you buy a cheap tool, you cry and cry and cry. Mm-hmm. And so, as I've had to make inexpensive purchases, in the past, but now I'm I'm in a position where I can replace them with something that's a little bit better quality. And then, it's not that I regret buying, some of the tools I have, were given to me, were free, and so, they work really well. But in some cases, it's, you sort of think, I probably should have splurged a little bit more for something a bit better. So,
Yeah.
you end up buying if you end up buying anything on Amazon, I feel like I have a lot of students who have bought I can't remember the name of it, but it's like it's a power tool, but it's black and it's got orange writing on it. I can't remember what they're called, but
is it
anyway.
Wen? Or
yeah.
WEN?
Right, and I mean they're like tool-like objects. I mean they're not, they look like a tool, but they're not really. And so, people buy them because they're inexpensive, and then they get them into their shops, and they're like, oh my goodness, this thing doesn't work. And then, right away there's that remorse, right?
Yeah. Well, and I've also had it where people have felt, I don't know, it's like they almost take it personally in the fact that I have these tools, but when I try and do X operation, it doesn't turn out. I'm a terrible woodworker.
Right.
When it's not necessarily the case.
Well,
sometimes you can legitimately blame your tools.
Oh, I agree 100%. I experience that with hand planes all the time. A lot of people, will say, oh, well, they don't make them like they used to make the Stanleys. And it's like, well, thank goodness for that. Companies in North America like Lee Nielsen and Veritas, they took all of the kind of design cues and functionality cues from Stanley, but then actually made them so that they work.
Right.
And I teach people how to soup up, vintage Stanley planes, right? Because some people are really interested in that. And I think there's a lot to learn about a hand plane by completely stripping it apart, right? Mm-hmm. And then putting it back together. It's not like you lose value in doing that, but it's always awesome when someone soups up a number 5 Stanley and they put a hawk iron in it and they get it all up and running. It's ready to go. And they use it and they're like, yeah, this is really, really good. And then a few months later, they buy a low angle plane, right? From either Lee Nielsen or Veritas. And they're blown away. There's just this is completely different. And it's yeah. You know what I mean? It's you can fix up a Pinto,
right?
And it'll drive. And you hope you don't get rear-ended, but then you buy a Porsche 911 Targa, and now all of a sudden, now you're moving.
It's now you're getting something.
Now things are happening, So, it's, and I think you have to go through that. You have, you know what I mean. And I have Stanley planes in my shop. My favorite sort of scrub plane is a Stanley number 5 with a cambered iron in it, and it doesn't need to work really well. It's an axe with a soul. That's all it is. It just needs to remove stuff real fast, and then I'll worry about the surface later.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely one of those things where you certainly can blame your tools, like a cheap saw, those sorts of things. I was very fortunate to get my hands on a bat axe. Bat axe panel saw, and that's nothing else in this world. I've owned old Distons, I've owned newer saws, I've owned all kinds of stuff, but just something about a really well-made tool that is sharpened, it's all hand-fettled and hand-tuned, and it's it just goes. It just does what it's supposed to do. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I wasn't a horrible woodworker.
Yes.
I just had an old distant saw that had just a bit too much set on one side, and it kept coming out. Yeah.
I can make left-hand turns all day long.
That's right. Yeah, that's it.
Well, you alluded to it too, is being able, talked about maintaining your tools, but, when you do a class and you teach somebody and you hand them a tool, like a chisel or something that you've sharpened, whereas they're I bought these just before the class. They're brand new. Of course they're sharp. Being able to see that light go off and the angels singing when they, oh, sharp.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's a totally different thing. Yeah. And people, I always ask that, when people say, oh, well, I'm having trouble taking like really fine shaving. And it's like, okay, well, I know what's going on. And so I say, well, how did you sharpen your tools? Oh, yeah. No, they're sharp. Okay. Right? Like some people's idea of sharp is like just kind of touching the chisel to the spinning belt grinder, which, in some cases that may work. I mean, if you're banging out quick mortises and 2x4s or, whatever, maybe. But, so you've got to sort of have this idea. Sharpening's a big one. Like that's a huge gate for people to get through as far as like going to the sort of next level with woodworking is once you learn. I took like a weekend long sharpening class at Rosewood before I was even a student there. And I mean, that was like the light bulb moment where I understood what sharp really was. And then, strove towards it all the time. Right. So, nowadays it's like, now it's just sort of commonplace, but I always encourage everybody to like, figure it out, however you have to do it, whether you want to use it with a machine or you want to do it with a jig or, whatever, just figure it out,
Yeah. Now, the shop that you're in now, how is it conditioned? Because you talked about it being a separate building.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that's something that wasn't in there to begin with.
No, when I bought it, it had a wood stove in it. And the guy that owned this place beforehand used to do a lot of sort of mechanical work. So he had like a half-built go-kart in there, and he had like a boat motor that was, in various pieces all over the place. And then he also had a wall in the dividing the space. So on the other side is where he stored his like lawnmower and all that other stuff. It was kind of like a shed or whatever. So first thing I did was I busted that wall out of there to get maximum kind of square footage out of it. But then I took the wood stove out. Like everybody was like, oh, but the wood stove, that would have been so nice. And I'm like, yeah, nice and romantic and, have the nice heat and all that other stuff. But the reality is that when you tell the insurance company you've done that,
oh yeah,
right,
yeah,
they have a litter of kittens right there in front of you. So it's like, no, we're not doing that. Plus, you lose a ton of space, right, around that wood stove, and so I just didn't need that aggravation. So I took that out and I put one of those split units in, where so you have like the condenser unit outside, and then on the wall up top is the heating and the cooling and the fan and all that other stuff. So so it's set up. We bought this place in August last year, so the air conditioning is lovely, in the summertime, and then the winter time. It's a really well built building. Like it's brick all the way around and fully insulated and everything else. So I'm shocked at how little we've been paying to heat the place in the winter time. Although here in Southern Ontario, it's not winter like we used to have in Northern Ontario, where it was 6 months of snow. But in this case here, it's nice and comfortable in there. So I like it. It's but again, all of that comes at a cost, and you got to sort of weigh your options. I could have done like sort of space heaters and like a window banger air conditioner or no air conditioning.
Right.
But I don't know. Like I spent a lot of time in my life uncomfortable. So after a career in the military where you're the world is your sleeping cot. I don't want to be uncomfortable anymore. I don't want to be dripping sweat onto my projects, or having to like wear a toque while I'm woodworking, or a hat, beanie, whatever you guys call it. That's toque's a Canadian word, I guess. But
no, I had one of my roommates in college was from Upper Michigan, which is half Canada,
right?
I think.
Yeah.
So he used toque all the time.
Oh, okay. So. Yeah. A lot of people look at me funny when I say toque, and they're like, "What is that?" And I'm like, "Well, it's a winter hat."
Winter hat. Yeah. What else would you call it?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, John and I can definitely relate, because my shop is in the back of my unattached 2-car garage, and I have a space heater, and it's okay. But when it gets really cold out, then it's like, no, I just can't. or won't. And then in the summer, there's, you setting up 3 fans and hope you get a breeze that day. And
Right.
Yeah. It's
so I
definitely
can imagine
nice.
that the split unit is nice just because it just evens it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it like in the winter months, I leave it set to, here we go. I leave it set to 18 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
We'll try not to get into the metric imperial debate. So I mean, it's like sweater weather, So, and then if I want it a little bit warmer, if I'm doing finish or a glue up or whatever, then I'll, bump it up a little bit. And then in the summertime, I'm more concerned about the humidity, to be honest.
Right.
It's the humidity that kills you. It could be 90 degrees in there, right? But if the humidity is 50% or so, it's tolerable, I find.
Sure.
Whereas if it's 75 degrees but the humidity is 80,
Oh yeah.
it's just not comfortable,
Yeah.
So
You pitting out just walking into your shop,
well, that's it. Yeah. You need it like Arizona, right? Like it's a dry heat,
Yeah.
which is a crock of hooey, by the way, because I've been to Arizona in the summertime when I was in the military, and they were like, "Oh no, but it's a dry heat." I'm like,
It's a
"No,
dry
it's
heat,
still
yeah.
friggin' hot.
Yeah.
It's horrible."
That's called roasting.
Yeah.
Like literally the definition of roasting.
Absolutely. It's like just a slow go, like you're just like you're there for a week and you're like, "Oh, I'm done."
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So one thing that I wanted to touch on is, and you brought it up earlier. Now that you're kind of a full-time woodworker, is what can hobbyist woodworkers learn from professionals, and also conversely, what can hobbyists teach professionals?
Oh, that's
Because I feel like
interesting.
sometimes there's the dichotomy of, people who will say, well, you're a hobbyist woodworker, so you have all the time in the world. And that's not necessarily true either.
No. It's interesting. I always say that hobbyists have all the power. They do, because they don't have to worry about making a living, right? That's a lot of stress.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Or it can be. And so when you're a hobbyist, like, you can experiment. You can try different things. And if it doesn't go well, okay, you're out a bit of time and you're out a bit of material. Who cares, right?
Yeah.
But if you're a woodworker professionally and you can't afford to screw things up, right? And then I think hobbyists, could really learn about efficiency from professionals. And like I kind of alluded to earlier, like, if you're a hobbyist, your time might be more precious than that of a professional, because a professional's in his shop 8-10 hours a day, 6 days a week, they're working the whole time. But when you get between familial responsibilities and that sort of thing, like, you might have 2 hours in a weekend to get into the
Right.
shop, or a couple of nights, through the week, or whatever. So you got to be ready to go, right? Like, when you walk in that door, it's go time. It's time to play, and I think like Michael Fortune, the Canadian furniture maker up here, he's like the one thing I learned from him is that he is so completely regimented. Like,
Really?
he is in his shop at 8 a.m. He's had his breakfast, he's had his coffee, he goes in that shop, and he works until 10. What is it? He works until 10:10, and then he stops, and he has a cup of tea and whatever his wife made that day, and then
Sure.
at 10:30 he's back on again, and he doesn't walk out of there until 1 o'clock. He has half an hour lunch, and then so he's very regimented. He does not answer the phone, he does not talk to clients, he does not do anything other than what the task is for that day. And
Wow.
like, most woodworkers are more of like a fart in a windstorm. You know, they're kind of they're like walking like, what am I going to do today? You know, and they you know, they kind of go in there, and which is fine. But and if that's what you enjoy doing, the puttering and the goofing around and stuff like that, that's, you know, that's for a lot of people, that's a great part of the hobby. But if you're trying to get a coffee table built, or you're, you know what I mean, you're like you're looking at the shop, like I just saw, I was on the website and I saw the shop stand. Your guys are giving away a free set of plans for the rolling shop cart. Is that yours, John, or?
I think that might have been Ted's. Oh no.
No, John did help build that one.
Okay.
So yeah, he was. Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean that, you know, that shop cart is, you know, it's a great little plan. You know what I mean? For if you're looking to build that, you know, you want to get through it. You don't want to, you know, kind of be futzing around for days. You know, I always used to laugh when I would go to Woodworking in America. And of course, you know, that was at the time when Chris Schwarz had done his book on the Roubo bench. And he, you know, you'd see people there every year, right? They would sort of like, they would turn up every year, and you'd be like, "Hey, how's it going?" You know, you'd recognize them, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, really good. Like I got the second leg of my Roubo installed this year, man. It's like so awesome." And I'm like, "Whoa."
Whoa.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if I take a week to build a workbench, I'm going to panic, right? Because it's like, whoa, like I really, you know, I'm wasting a lot of time.
So now I promised Logan, who's usually one of our other hosts here, that we would discuss it. So I'm going to say 10 words and have you go from there. Metric system.
10 words.
Metric system.
See what I did there? So you obviously teach woodworkers in the U.S. as well as in Canada, and therefore have to be dimensionally bilingual.
No, I don't. No, I don't at all, actually.
No?
No. I get a lot of grumbling from American students.
Do you?
Yeah, but I encourage them to try it.
Sure.
You know, because, and listen, up until maybe 5 years ago, I was still working in Imperial as well.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, you know, Canada is metric, you know, kind of, sort of, right? Like
in public,
right? Yeah. When we think someone's looking, yeah. No, the like, so for example, like we measure things in kilometers an hour versus miles. We measure weights at the grocery store in grams or kilograms. But when we talk about one's body weight, a lot of times we still refer to them weighing in pounds. And so there's this sort of like, you know, it's not like a place like Sweden where it's like, it's metric, right? Like that's it. You know, and they, you know, quite frankly, if you're going to change your system of measurement, they did it really well. They basically made it illegal in the 70s to sell or measure anything in the imperial system.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so it forced the change. It was basically an overnight change, and you had, and then after a certain amount of time, you were able to then start to, you know, you could start selling imperial measuring tapes again for people who still wanted to use them or whatever. But what it did is it forced the change. And then you don't get these sort of double sort of, you know, like England is the same way, right? Like they, you know, some work in millimeters, some work in inches. They're still in miles an hour. They drive on the wrong friggin' side of the road, you know, like, and they'll tell you it's the right side though. Yeah. But they're not wrong. Yeah. But they're wrong. But there, that might get a couple of calls today.
There you go.
But yeah, so the metric system. The hardest part about using the metric system in woodworking is visualization, right?
Sure.
If I say to you, listen, I need a piece about, 300 mil, right? You're going to look at me like, what? Right? Yeah. But if I said 12 inches, you'd be like, oh, yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Right? So being able to visualize comes like, it's just like a language, right? When you're learning a new language and you start to think in that language, now you've got it. right?
Yeah, and you're not constantly translating.
Exactly. So I'm at a point now, because I wrote so many articles for magazines in Germany and England and Australia, they all work in the metric system. And so I was kind of forced into it. And then as I started doing that, I started understanding like the advantages here. You know what I mean? So, like you're not adding a bunch of fractions that have different denominators, and I know some people are pretty fast at it, you know what I mean, that they can add an eighth and 30 seconds and 5/16, and all that other stuff. But I find, like, my God, the amount of times I've done like 3/16 instead of 3/8, or whatever. And so for me, working in base 10 is it's a much simpler situation. And in fact, I don't even care if you work in the metric system. If you work in imperial, at least work in decimal inches. You know what I mean? Because if you can say 10.2 inches, right? Like now you don't have this crazy fraction action happening, right?
Yeah.
And so I find that the math becomes much easier, and then you can move a decimal place over and go from millimeters to centimeters or centimeters to kilometers. You can do whatever you want. And then there's also all the associations of like a gram of water is like 1 centimeter cubed, and like there's all these other relationships that happen like within the metric system that kind of make them sort of seamlessly transition from one to the other. So anyway, I think like I get a lot of pushback from some people, and it's like I just say, listen, just try it. Right?
Sure.
When you're working with me, you've hired me, you're learning, like, let's try it. And if you don't like it, that's fine. You can go back to Imperial. But like when I run a webinar and stuff and it's a project-based class, the students all get a cut list in millimeters. And if they need to, if they prefer to work in inches, then by all means, there's free calculators and apps that will kind of go from one to the other, so you can do that. And then when they start seeing like 7/64, they're like, so. And that's the other thing too. I think like a lot of times the fidelity is too high, and 30 seconds of an inch are about as small as a dimension that I want to work with, which is about a millimeter. You start getting into 64ths and stuff, and it's like, first of all, my 45-plus-year-old eyes cannot even see those things, And really, a lot of my students realize that the measurements are kind of just for like rough sort of starting, but when it really counts, I'm taking a measurement. I'm doing a referential measurement right off of whatever it is, and that's the
you're gauging to real life.
Exactly. And that can be frustrating when you're, as you guys probably understand, when you have to create a plan. It's like, well, it needs to have a dimension, and sometimes a dimension's ridiculous, right? It's like, who the heck would pick that number? But it ends up being.
We need to have that number, but you can't.
Right. Yeah.
And you can't really say like, well, it doesn't matter from here on out, but because it sort of does.
Right.
But yeah,
I suppose you could, once you got to a certain point, you could say, okay, take a story stick and then whatever that opening is, that's how wide your drawer is. And then, you know what I mean? But that's sort of an abstract, a lot of people would really struggle with that. That'd be an interesting course idea though.
Yeah, it would be. I think it would be kind of fun. It's like where, you're going to get a basic case, assembled and put together. But then after that, everything is dependent on what already exists, whether it's drawers or even the top, because then it's whatever your case plus whatever kind of overhang you want. So there's your sizing for all that. You don't really, outside of the initial 12 pieces, you're kind of done with a measuring tape.
Yeah, well, I used to teach a class on making a workbench. And of course, the ideal sort of height for a workbench is up to your wrist, sort of in the standing position for a lot of hand tool operations. And so we literally used to start the class with a story stick. And I'd give them a story stick that is long enough to do the length of the bench, which we were doing about 60 inches. Every student got a stick, and then they would all help each other put that first mark on there. And then I'd say, okay, there's your top material. Mark from there down, there's your top material. Everything else, leg.
Yeah.
You don't need any other measurements now. You've got the length of your bench. We had the width as well. But everything else was all referential. And people were like, oh, this is fantastic. And it's like, yeah, no math. Because math leads to mistakes, and mistakes leads to drinking. So,
right, yeah, and then to the dark side.
To the dark side. To the dark side. So true.
All right, so let's we usually wrap things up here by kind of talking about projects that we're working on. I'm in the midst of finishing up a dresser for my son.
Excellent.
And it's a craftsman piece, and been battling usually just weather in an unconditioned shop on when you can, like, when's the really good day to apply a couple of coats of finish. And then it's like, that's what I'm doing today.
Yeah, that's always tough, when I remember those days where you'd have to, like, really pick and choose what you were doing at certain times.
Yeah. I've also discovered that over the winter, I had just been using my tools and not really sharpening them. So, it's like you grab this chisel because it's sharp. Then the next day you grab that chisel because it's sharp. And now I'm got to pay the piper on that one and sharpen them all.
I used to do that with card scrapers all the time. I would just buy more card scrapers. and then I would spend an afternoon doing card scrapers. And then when they would get dull, they would go into the dull pile. And then, anyway, I stopped doing that. I think I have 2 card scrapers now.
Yeah. So how about you, Vic? What do you got working on?
So right now I'm working on a couple of articles and some content for a lumber company that's here in Canada that I create some content for. And I'm working on a commission right now for a blanket chest for a client. They wanted a nice sort of more mid-century modern walnut blanket chest. So just at the point now where I'm going to put the it's almost done. I just got to put the hinges and the stays and that's kind of stuff on it, and then probably just another coat of wax, and I think I'm off to the races. So
cool.
Yeah. So that'll be cool, and then I have to start building furniture for this house, because the goal is to have every piece of furniture built by me by the time I cack off. So I figure I got a good 30 years before I have to worry about that. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Will Vic, where can we find your new book?
So you can get it right from my website, victesolin.com. That's if you want a signed copy. So obviously I'm not Amazon. I can't send it to you for free and all that fun stuff. So so you end up paying a little bit more for it that way. But you can get it right from the publisher, Blue Hills. And I'm sure that it'll be available in, sort of most woodworking retailing stores or bookstores or anything like that. So
sure. And then that's where we can also find you for your classes as well.
Yeah, my classes. And then I do quite a bit of stuff on Instagram. Not on the YouTubes very much. Just not my scene.
Sure.
And much to my 21-year-old daughter's chagrin, I'm also on TikTok, which which is
take that.
Yeah, they're like, "Whoa, you're kind of old for TikTok," and I'm like, "Well,
There you go. All right. Well, we'll put links to all of that in the show notes page. Otherwise, if you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks about today's episode, you can leave that on the description on our YouTube channel, or you can send us an email, woodsmith@woodsmith.com. That wraps it up for another episode of the Shop Notes Podcast, and we'll see you again next week, everybody. Bye.
This episode of Shop Notes Podcast is brought to you by Woodsmith Plans. You'll find nearly 1,000 plans covering everything that you'd want to build. From furniture projects to gift projects, kitchen accessories, workshop projects, and jigs and more. Find your next project at woodsmithplans.com.